Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you all are doing well. Today we're going to build a data lake using S3, Glue, and Athena. We're going to use S3 to store all our raw data. Then we're going to use Glue to discover the schema of the data. And finally, we're going to use Athena to query the S3 data using SQL. One big benefit you get out of this data lake is that you can aggregate data coming from different sources, such as a CSV file, DynamoDB tables, and RDS tables. And once you have all these data in S3, using Athena, you can query all of these data using SQL. Because without congregating or aggregating them into S3, you cannot really use SQL on a CSV file or a DynamoDB table. So having everything in one place really gives you the power to write very complicated SQL queries across all your different initial data sources. All right, so we're going to do everything from scratch, both in terms of the CSV file and DynamoDB table. So the first thing we're going to start with is the CSV file and how can we ingest it into S3. So over here, I have an example CSV file that I downloaded from Kaggle. This has all the crude oil prices for the last 30 years, I believe. Yeah, up till 2022. So we're going to use this data as a CSV file at first. So to give you a better idea of how the data looks, you can see we have 4 columns: date, price, percent change, and absolute change. All right, so the first step is going to be to put the data into S3. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go to S3. So you want all your individual data to be in top level buckets. So we're going to create a new bucket. Let's call it crude oil. If I can type, we're going to name it crude oil data CSV. We're going to keep everything as is. We're going to put this to assist one. And we're going to keep the default. So we're going to go ahead and create the bucket. There you go, the bucket was created. So let me just sort by creation date and then go in here. And then we're going to upload our file. Okay, we're going to go ahead, go to downloads, and then upload our CSV file. Upload. All right, so now our bucket called crude oil data CSV has the .csv file. Okay, so going back to the diagram, we have our CSV file in our S3 bucket right now. Now let's go ahead and make it available into Athena altogether. And once we do that, we're going to move on to DynamoDB. So now that we have in S3, our next task is going to be to discover the schema of this data using Glue. So I'm going to go to Glue from services. So where is Glue? There you go. Once in Glue, we're going to create something called a crawler. What a crawler lets you do is it lets you go to the bucket, crawl the data, and then discover the schema by itself. You can go ahead and make changes to the schema if you want to do it manually, but more often than not, crawler does a very good job to find the exact schema. So we're going to call it crude oil S3. We're going to call it crude oil S3 crawler. Okay. And then we're going to let it crawl all the folders. And the data store is going to be S3 because we just put the data in S3. You want to include the path, which is going to be crude oil data CSV, where you have the actual CSV file. All right, so is there like a region issue? Right, so I'm in Northern California. I'm going to choose US East 1 because that's where our data is, and do the whole thing. Okay, yeah, so going back to add the crawler, crude oil CSV S3, that's what we're gonna call it. And then we're gonna include the bucket. The bucket is gonna be crude oil CSV. And then next, that's the only data store. We wanna give it the access to S3 so that it can actually read the data from S3. Run on demand. And then the database, we're gonna create a new database. This is going to be the database where Glue stores all the metadata related to the crawler. This is not going to be replicating your data again. This is just going to be a few configuration and metadata file with the schema of the data. So we're going to call it, let's say, oil data. That's all we're going to call it. Prefix added to tables. We're going to prefix everything by prod underscore. That's just optional. You don't really have to do that. All right, so our crawler is ready. Now we're going to go ahead and run it. This is going to let us actually run the crawler and discover the schema. So, all right, so the status is starting. This is going to take a few seconds to up to like a minute or two. So while the crawler is running, we're going to go back to our diagram to explain what's happening right now. So as the first step, we put the CSV file into S3. That was pretty straightforward. Now we're using Glue to identify the schema of the CSV data. That's because in Athena, whenever you're querying the data, you're going to be using SQL. And just like any SQL databases, you want to know the schema of your data ahead of time. That's why you need to use Glue to find the schema. You could do this step manually too, but using Glue, when you have lots of different data sources, it becomes really easy to discover all the schema very, very quickly. So we're gonna give it a few more seconds. So it's stopping right now. That means the crawler has done its job. And you can see table added is 1. So the table should be added. If we go to tables over here, you can see that it found one table called prod. That's the prefix we gave it. And then crude oil data CSV. This is the S3 bucket's name. Now let's go to Athena and actually see if we can query this data now. Okay, so we're gonna go to AWS and then go to Athena. That's the logo for Athena. And now in Athena, you wanna choose the database, which is gonna be your oil data. Once again, this is the Glue database where Glue is storing the metadata information. It's not duplicating your data. So yeah, you see one table that was found. And it already discovered that it had a date field, a price field, percent change, and change. If you look at our original data, that's exactly what it had too. So pretty neat. And now you can literally do like a select query in S3, just like in any SQL database. We give it the name, and then let's just limit it to 10. We're gonna run it, and you see we get all 10 rows over here, which is very, very cool. We went from having a CSV file which was not queryable to the CSV file in S3, but now it's easily queryable. So you can literally like do like where price greater than, let's say 30, right? Yeah, so you can do whatever query you want, which is very, very cool. Okay. So now going back to the diagram, we did the CSV file, which was very straightforward. Now we're going to do the same thing for the DynamoDB table, because DynamoDB is a very common database that is used in almost any application. So we're going to do it from scratch. I'm going to go to DynamoDB and create a new table. This is DynamoDB, and then let's go ahead and create a very simple table. Don't focus too much on what the schema of the table is, because we're just going to create like a very quick one, but this can be whatever your table is in your application. So we're going to name it, let's say oil manufacturer, or let's just call it like oil company or something. Yeah. And let's give it like a company ID, which is going to be the partition key, and I'm going to give it like a number data type. All right, so that's going to be our partition key, and our table is being created right now. It should take a few seconds, but shouldn't take too long. What we're essentially doing is creating a new DynamoDB table, and then once the table is created, we're going to do the exact same thing we did for the CSV file, which was to use Glue to discover the schema once the table is there in S3, and then use Athena to query it. So the table has been created. I'm going to go in there, explore table items, and then I'm going to create a few new rows. So we're going to give it like a company ID 1, And then let's give it like another column called name, and we're gonna call it, let's say, chevron. Yep, so there you go. We're gonna create another item, give it a company ID of 2, and give it a name of, let's say, British Petroleum. Okay, so we're gonna create the item again. And that's all we're gonna have here. This is just to show you how it's gonna work in Data Lake, so I won't go into too much of the details of DynamoDB. So now we have the table here. The next thing you wanna do is, if you look at the diagram here, to be able to query your data using Athena, you want them to be in S3 first. Just like in the CSV file, we had to put it in S3 at the beginning. Even though your data for the DynamoDB table exists in DynamoDB, you won't be able to query it directly using Athena. You need to somehow put this DynamoDB table into S3 at first. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're gonna go to our DynamoDB, we're gonna go to tables, and then we're gonna go to our table, which is called oil company. And then we're gonna go to this option called exports and streams. We're gonna hit that, and then we're gonna pick export to S3. Once you do that, it's gonna tell you to enable PITR. Just go ahead and do that, and then browse S3. So now you wanna put the data in a top level S3 bucket. So every single data source you have should be in its own bucket. Otherwise, Athena is gonna have a tough time knowing what to query. So we're gonna go ahead and just hit cancel for a minute so that we can create our new S3 bucket. So I'm gonna go back and create the new bucket first. So let's go to S3, and then let's create a new bucket over here. And we're gonna call it oil company DynamoDB. Okay, that should be good. Let's go ahead and create the bucket. The bucket has been created. So now we're gonna go back to our DynamoDB table, which is over here. We're gonna go to tables, go to our oil company, go to exports and streams, go to export to S3. And now our bucket should be here, the one we just created. Let's just call it, what was it? Oil company? Yeah, so oil company DynamoDB, that was our S3 bucket. We're gonna go ahead and hit export. So now it has started exporting. You can see it just started exporting. This is gonna take a few minutes to export, so we're gonna give it a few minutes. What we're essentially doing right now is we have a DynamoDB table that we just created, and we put in some new data. Now we are exporting the data into AWS S3. In this system, or in this architecture, we are doing this as a batch process. So every time you want to export your data from DynamoDB to S3, you are going to need to create a new export. However, you can do this in real time if you enable a Kinesis data stream. I am going to have a future video showing the exact same thing. But for now, as the first data lake video, I'm going to just let you see how the batch process works, because this is more straightforward. So we are populating S3 with our new DynamoDB table, and we are putting it in a top level bucket of its own, rather than putting both the DynamoDB and CSV data in the same bucket. Once again, you want to keep them in separate buckets, because otherwise Glue might find your schema, but Athena won't be able to query it because it can't really differentiate easily between your CSV data and DynamoDB data if both of them are in the same bucket. So you want to keep every single source in its own bucket. So if you have 3 different sources, you want to have 3 separate buckets. All right, so we're going to give it a few minutes. I'm going to cut the video here and come back and explain the next steps once the export is complete. Okay. All right, so after waiting a few minutes, the export is completed now of the DynamoDB table. So you can see the status is completed. So at this point, our DynamoDB table should be replicated in S3. So let's go ahead and check that out first. So once again, we are at this stage, DynamoDB to S3. So we want the data to be in there. Let's go to S3. If you remember the name of the bucket, it was called Oil Company DynamoDB. And you see we have a new folder where we have all our data and other metadata things that DynamoDB exports to S3. Essentially, our data is over here. All right, so now this portion should be done, DynamoDB to S3. Now let's go ahead and use Glue to discover the schema. So we're gonna go to Glue from our list of services and then do the same thing we did for the CSV file. But this time there's gonna be a small difference, which you're gonna see in a bit. So we need a new crawler, of course, because it's a new bucket. So we're gonna add the new crawler. We're gonna call it crude oil, let's say DynamoDB. Once again, the data is in S3. So our bucket is gonna be called, where is that? So what's our bucket called? Oil Company DynamoDB. That's our DynamoDB bucket. There you go. Next, we're gonna give it the access to read from S3 again. And then run on demand. The database, we're gonna put it in oil data again. And then we're gonna preface this by prod2. All right. So our crawler is ready to run. So we're gonna go ahead and hit run it now. And this is gonna start our crawler, which is running right now. So what we're essentially doing right now is Glue is gonna go to the S3 bucket that you saw and go ahead and try to find the data. If you recall, I'm gonna go and show that to you. If you recall, in S3, we did not only have the data, we also had a few other metadata. So this was our export. And within that, you can see we have these files too, and then our data is over here. So when Glue finds the tables, it might try to find some tables related to these two, but you can just ignore them. You can just use whatever the data is. All right, so we are gonna go back to Glue to see how the crawler is doing. There we go. So we're gonna go to tables. Let's see if it found a table. So it found a bunch of them. So let's go to the crawler. So you see our crawler is stopping and it found 5 tables. Now let's go and see what these 5 tables were. If you see the 5 tables, I'm gonna sort them by the time. Okay, so this was our CSV table from beforehand. And then it found 5 new tables, and the only one you care about is the prod data, because if you remember, our data was in that data directory. So that's the only one we need to query. So I'm going to go to Athena now to actually query the data. Okay. So let's go to Athena. So once again, we now have our DynamoDB table in S3. We used Glue to find the schema of the table. And now we're going to use Athena to query our DynamoDB data that has been replicated into S3 using SQL. So you see, before we only had the CSV, now we have all these. So if you remember, we want to just ignore these. So you can just delete them if you want to, that works too, but we're just going to keep them. Prod data, let's go ahead and do a preview table. So you see, you have these DynamoDB table data directly in Athena that you can query. But you can see that these are in like JSON formats or some other format. It's not really how you want to, how you want to query it. So you can just do a simple select statement to like change it. So you could do like select, and then you could do something like item.company ID.n as company ID. So that's going to be going to item, then .company ID, and then going to n, and then setting that as company ID. You can also do the other one, which is going to be our name. So you can do item.name.s as name. And then you can do from, the name is prod data. Okay, let's run this query. And you see now we have the same DynamoDB data, but in like a table format, which is very, very cool. You can do things like from table, we can add like a where clause if you want to, where like company ID equals 1. You can do stuff like that. So essentially, is it like a right. So maybe you can do this. Let's try this out. Yeah, so essentially what's happening is, let me just show you. So this is giving you the data in this format. Now you want to save this table or just alias it and then query on top of this table to let you easily do all your SQL query. This is because when Glue is discovering the data, it just finds one column called item, because that's how the DynamoDB export works. You can go ahead and define the schema. I'm not going to go into it, but it is possible to make it more straightforward. But in this case, it works too, because you can just create an alias for this format like actual SQL table, and then do your all your queries on top of it. And for the CSV file, you can also do the query if you remember. That works too. So now we have both our CSV file and our DynamoDB file, both in S3. Both are queryable, and you can query both using SQL, which is very cool. All right, so I'm not going to go into RDS because that is already a SQL table and it's just the same as you did for CSV and DynamoDB. But hopefully this gives you a good idea of how you can have a data lake and make all the data queryable. I'm going to do like a final summary of how the whole architecture is working. And I'm also going to link this photo if possible in the description so that you can see how the whole thing works. All right, so to begin with, we had two sources of data. One was a CSV file, which was over here. And one was a new DynamoDB table data. A new DynamoDB table that we created and put in some mock data. The first step was to get both of these into S3. So we went ahead and uploaded the CSV file into S3. And for the DynamoDB table, we went ahead and used the built-in DynamoDB feature to export the data into S3. One thing to be mindful about is you want to keep these in separate S3 buckets, otherwise you might have issues when Athena is trying to query it. Once we had both of these data into S3, we went ahead and used Glue to discover the schema. The way we did that is we created something called Glue crawlers. The crawlers can crawl your S3 bucket and get whatever data there is and find the schema of the data, right? So we created two crawlers for the two different S3 buckets, one for the CSV data, one for the DynamoDB data. The crawlers took a few minutes to run, and then it discovered the schema for both of these. And these schemas become available in Athena. Once the schemas are available in Athena, you can just use Athena directly to query any data that you want in S3. So in our case, both CSV and DynamoDB data. And you could see that over here. So we had two tables. One was the CSV file, which you could just preview. And you see the whole data was here. And similarly for our DynamoDB, it wasn't in the best format, but you could easily create a select statement with some aliasing and then run it, and your data should be right here. This is a DynamoDB table, and now you can just do any SQL query in your DynamoDB data, which is very cool. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments. I am gonna have a few more videos about data lake and data warehouses in AWS, because I think the power you get from these AWS services is quite a lot. And instead of creating your own infrastructure from scratch, you can easily utilize these to get something scalable running very, very quickly. With that being said, hopefully this was helpful to you, and I'm gonna catch you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.